Hi, I've already addressed the war against Iran in several videos. I'll put a link to at least one of them up above me. But because the war appears to be growing and there's no end in sight, and it also looks like it's getting messier, I thought it would be good to attend to some of the sort of adjacent topics that help sort of inform the context, and I think will help everybody, including myself, think about the war in general. And mainly what I want to do is I want to talk about whether or not, like, what does it mean if the Gulf states were to throw their full weight into the war effort? This video is about the military of the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. It is going to be the first of a series of videos about Gulf countries. The next video will be about Saudi Arabia. And in it, I'm going to talk about the UAE's military. How big is it? How much money does it have? What kind of military does it have? What is it designed to be able to do? How good is it? And then sort of take a step back and think about, well, what if the UAE were to really throw itself into this war? What would that actually mean for the overall war effort? If you're new here, my name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. As usual, if you like this video, please help support the channel. You could hit like and subscribe. Also, think about throwing some money my way, either by hitting the thanks button here or by buying me a coffee using the link below in the description. Plus, you could also consider becoming a member here on YouTube, which would make you one of the coolest people on the planet. And please check out the merch, which I design myself, which you can find below. Nifty stuff. Anyways, so let's get cracking here. Today I want to walk you through three things. First, I want to do an overview of the United Arab Emirates military. Its size, its budget, what's its purpose, who serves in the military, do they have conscription, what is the UAE's military designed to be able to do. Second, I want to provide a general assessment, kind of what is it capable of, what has it accomplished in the past, and also how does it compare to other countries in the region, most notably Saudi Arabia. Third, I want to get into kind of a risky conversation about why people seem to think that the UAE's military is unusually good for the region. Now, this gets tricky because these comparisons and discussions often end up talking about why Arab armies usually perform badly, and then why is it that UAE seems to be some sort of exception that proves the rule. This is a tricky conversation because if we're going to assume that Arab armies historically perform badly, the academic search for understanding why tends to lead us to sort of risky, almost essentialist arguments about Arab culture, Arab politics, that sort of thing. And that's where we get into kind of treacherous water that I'm very careful of. And this is going to be one of these cases where like retweeting is not an endorsement. I'm going to tell you what some people think without necessarily weighing in and saying that, yeah, I totally agree with this based on my own research. Let's start with the money. In budget terms, the UAE is a really heavy spender. Recent market and think tank analyses put the Emirati defense spending in the low to mid $20 billion range. They spent roughly $23 to $24 billion in 2025. This is rising, according to the estimates, towards $25 billion in 2026. Although with the war going on, I bet it's going to get a lot higher. Some of the projections in the past have talked about $30 billion by 2030, but really I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being a much larger figure. This is on par with what many European NATO members spend, and for a small population, this translates into a very high spend per citizen. SIPRI, which is the Stockholm International something, there is a think tank in Sweden. Their regional breakdown puts the sort of average Middle Eastern spending at about 4% of GDP. On defense, in 2023, the UAE is usually at the higher end of that. It's also shifted from a pure importer of military gear to a state that wants to develop its own defense industry, most visibly with drones, munitions, and also increasingly armored vehicles of various kinds. Most of the recent open source estimates that I've read, and what I do is I read a lot of open source estimates and I cobble together, but I have to be very careful. I'm not going to fight over these numbers. You know, this is sort of what I'm seeing. They might be wrong, and if you believe otherwise, please feel free to weigh in on the comments. I would actually welcome that. Most of these estimates put the active duty strength of the Emirati military at about 63 to 65,000 people across all the services. This is small by regional standards. The Saudis, for instance, have 250,000, 250,000 active troops, but it's a very significant number for a nation that has only about 10 million residents, and interestingly enough, only about 1.3 or million of the people who live in the UAE are actually citizens. It's really interesting. 1.3 to 1.5 million citizens, and everybody else is basically an expat that just happens to be living there. So if we break down the 63 to 65,000 number, a reasonable working distribution is about 44 to 45,000 people in the land forces, and that's including the Presidential Guard and the regular army. You've got 4,000 to 5,000 people in the Air Force and in air defense, and then another 2,000 to 3,000 people in the Navy. On top of that, there are reportedly a large reserve component and also auxiliaries. Global Firepower, which is one of these open sources, estimates that there are about 130,000 reservists and 12,000 paramilitary forces. But the core of the combat power is really the 65,000 active duty troops. The land forces are structured into a brigade-centric army nested within a joint force structure that also includes a strong and sizable air and naval component. The army itself has roughly 300 Leclerc main battle tanks. That's actually more than the French army, so that's pretty impressive. And about 76 South African G6 self-propelled 155 millimeter artillery systems. They have 600 BMP-3s and 700 Rabdan infantry fighting vehicles, which is an Emirati-produced variant of the Turkish autocar Arma. It's a better protected variant of the Turkish version, and it's designed to take the BMP-3 turret. Apparently what they're doing is they're replacing the BMPs, and as they're doing it, they're pulling the turrets off of the BMPs and installing them on these essentially Turkish designed vehicles that the Emiratis themselves are making. The Emirati Air Force is relatively large and modern. It has 80 Block 60 F-16s and 60 Mirage 2000s. It's also ordered 80 Rafale fighter jets. To my knowledge, it has not actually received any of the Rafale yet. A notable aspect of the Emirati Air Force is that it has an ability to project force and operate outside of the country. It is operated from outside bases, and also it has tanker planes. It now has a fleet of about four Airbus A330 MRT tankers. And then using this, operating overseas or operating with the tankers, the Emirati Air Force has conducted airstrikes in Afghanistan, Libya, and Yemen. And then beginning in 2019, the Emiratis also began using Chinese drones to conduct long-range airstrikes. The Navy is very Jeune. It's a small force, mostly in terms of coastal defenses. It consists of corvettes and smaller vessels that are nonetheless very well armed with various anti-ship missiles. Doesn't have any frigates or anything bigger really than a corvette. The really remarkable thing, though, about the Emirati Navy is its amphibious capabilities. The UAE's Navy has, from what I've read, 31 amphibious ships, including several LSTs and LCUs and landing craft of different kinds. The UAE has used these vessels to conduct operations in the Yemen war to, for example, reinforce Aden, to break the Houthi encirclement around Aden, and then it also at one point used Eritrea as a staging base for amphibious operations against Houthi-controlled islands and the Houthi positions on the Yemeni coast. I'm going to say a bit more about that later. A few words about air defenses. I'm not going to say much because actually this has been covered in the news a lot lately for good reasons. Well, bad reasons depending. Bad reasons because the Emiratis have been, they're getting attacked a lot by the Iranians. The Iranians, I think, have fired actually more missiles at the UAE than Israel itself. That's bad. The good part is that the Emiratis appear to have been doing a really, really good job of shooting down most of these missiles and most of the Iranian drones that are sent against them. How have they done this? Well, because the UAE operates the kind of gold-plated, integrated, multi-tiered air defense system that you can have if you've got tons of money, and also if you've got good relations with different vendors so that you can sort of pick and choose different systems from different companies. So for instance, they have American THAAD, THAAD, sort of long-range air defense systems. They also have Israeli Barak systems, American Patriot systems. You've got South Korean stuff and Russian stuff, like mix and match, but apparently they've all integrated fairly well and done a really good job. And the results seem to speak for themselves because the UAE is really holding up quite well under the barrage of Iranian missiles and drone attacks. Doesn't mean that, some of the stuff obviously gets through, which is inevitable, but by and large, only a small portion of the stuff actually gets through. I'd like to say a few words about who serves in the Emirati military, because I think this is interesting, given that the UAE is weird in that only like 11 to 13% of the country consists of citizens and everybody else is an expat. From everything I've read, now there's no official breakdown that I could find in terms of who's in the Emirati military, but it appears to be the case that mostly it's actually Emiratis themselves, including sort of in the key combat positions. So the regular armed forces, especially combat arms, the Air Force and the Presidential Guard are all predominantly Emirati. They do have foreigners in three main roles. They have foreigners who are specialists, like trainers, some Western pilots. They also have foreigners serving as senior NCOs and planners and people who are embedded in key units. They also have contract soldiers who've had prior service, military service somewhere else, who fill niche technical or staff positions. And then they also make extensive use of mercenaries and proxy contingents in external theaters like Yemen. They did this in Yemen, but more covertly, also Libya, and today in Sudan. In Yemen, for example, the UAE actually apparently recruited thousands of experienced Colombian soldiers, Colombians of all people, on contract, and there are various reports documenting Latin Americans, Sudanese, and other foreigners fighting under Emirati direction. But the Presidential Guard and the best land and air units are mostly Emiratis with some foreigners here and there in order to lend expertise and to add a little bit additional mass. The UAE does have military conscription, is compulsory national service for men, voluntary national service for women. Reportedly, the official rhetoric, but also like this is sort of like a social engineering project in terms of building identity, discipline, fitness. I mean, these are the citizens who are being drafted, not the expats, and trying to unify a diverse population. From what I've read, though, and so that's the more important part of the project. It's not about mass mobilization, so you can create these massive militaries. But there's also a practical side of this, which is apparently what the UAE does is they benefit from conscription. They use conscription in order to identify the most promising young people and to pull them into professional careers. So it's just a great way of talent scouting among the general population and actually trying to identify talent and recruiting talent. So if you put this all together, what you get is a picture of a small but fairly dense and extremely well-equipped military with a heavy emphasis on high-end platforms, elite units, and selective recruitment. Next question is the assessment. How good is this? Right. How good is the Emirati military? What have they done? Now, the Emirati military, generally speaking, has a very good reputation. For example, this General Mathis, who for a while was the Secretary of Defense, he has described the UAE as a little Sparta. The most well-known report on the Emirati military is by a guy named Ken Pollock, who wrote something called Sizing Up Little Sparta. Ken Pollock, if you ask, okay, who's Ken Pollock? Ken Pollock is a big deal, high caliber analyst at the Washington Institute and formerly at the American Enterprise Institute. He's got a great reputation in DC. He's a big gun and people take him very, very seriously, which is not to say he's right all the time. It's not to say I necessarily agree with him or disagree with him. It's just that he's no idiot. He's got this great reputation. So people take him seriously and I take him seriously. So Pollock says that the UAE's armed forces are unquestionably the most capable among the Arab states, probably by a considerable margin. The best Emirati units include the Presidential Guard and the Joint Aviation Command, and there are also top Air Force squadrons. He says that these are pockets of excellence that are generally on par with smaller NATO militaries like the Dutch and the Belgians. The force is uneven. The bulk of the army is only modestly better, according to Pollock, than militaries. But then again, there are these pockets. It's modestly better, but then there are these pockets of real excellence. The standout formations include the Presidential Guard, which has about 12,000 people in it, and particularly its Special Operations Command. These are the whole thing. These are considered professional, highly selective, monitored very closely by Americans and other foreigners. The Presidential Guard is reportedly commanded by a retired Australian general, a guy named Mike Hindmarsh. Can't even imagine how much money this guy must be paid. There are also a number of Western instructors embedded in key positions. There's the Joint Aviation Command. They operate Apaches, Chinooks, Blackhawks, and other helicopters. As for the Air Force, as I mentioned before, they have F-16s and they have Mirage 2000s. It's mostly operated, flown, and supported by actual Emiratis. They have a good track record in terms of operations. They were in Afghanistan. They were involved in the anti-ISIS campaign. They were involved in Yemen and in Libya. They've never had any actual air-to-air combat of any sort. Logistically speaking, According to Pollock, the UAE has done things that many large states struggle to do. They've been able to, in Yemen, for example, sustain a brigade-sized force in combat for around 5 years. They've been able to, for instance, support armored advances of up to 100 kilometers. And they were also able to mount long-range strikes into places like Libya. And of course, I mentioned Afghanistan and Yemen, etc. In terms of the combat record, the real test case, the most important example of the UAE at war is Yemen. From 2015 until I think relatively recently, the UAE sustained roughly a reinforced brigade, plus SOF and aviation, and also proxies, lots and lots of proxies. I think in recent years, it's mostly been a proxy fight. I don't think the UAE's been operating, I don't know when they withdrew, but it's mostly been a proxy fight. The key operations that the Emiratis have conducted include in 2015 their operations in Aden, in El Anad. These included the amphibious and sea-lift supported landing of armor and mechanized forces in Aden, followed by urban fighting to secure the port and the airport, and then there was a push north to recapture the El Anad air base. According to various online sources like Bellingcat, they were able to locate Emirati Leclerc main battle tanks and BAP-3 infantry fighting vehicles from both the regular army and the Presidential Guard in this campaign. They also had conducted amphibious operations on the Red Sea coast and the Bab el-Mandab. They did a series of coastal offensives, artillery, naval gunfire, and air rotary wing support. A very classic sort of joint operation kind of thing that they were able to do on different islands and in coastal locations. In 2016, there was the Mukalla operation. This was a combined operation in which UAE SOF and Presidential Guard, working with US, ISR, and local Yemeni partners, pushed al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula out of its de facto capital with relatively low collateral damage. That's what I read, relatively low collateral damage. Who knows what that means? 2018, we've got the Al Hudaydah. This is an operation called the Golden Victory Offensive, where UAE backed Yemeni forces with Emirati armor and naval and air support advanced on Hudaydah, but ultimately they stalled short of taking the city under international pressure and stiff Houthi resistance. Across all of these operations, independent assessments like Pollock's agree that there's a general picture here of strengths on the part of the UAE military. We have solid planning at the brigade and joint task force level. We have the effective integration of armor, mechanized infantry, artillery, helicopters, UAVs, and naval fire. There's a heavy reliance on proxies, which is cost effective. Emirati-trained Yemeni units, for instance, did much of the infantry fighting, backed by Emirati enablers. I guess arguably this is what they've been doing in Sudan as well. Pollock and others see Yemen as a coming of age of of the UAE as an expeditionary military capable of planning and mounting and sustaining force projection, expeditionary operations somewhere else, which is very difficult to do. This is not for amateurs. Their performance has not been flawless. There are credible reports of lots of abuse by Emirati-backed forces, of course, most recently Sudan, where the Emirati-backed Rapid Support Force is accused of all sorts of human rights violations and atrocities, and some say it's committed genocide, etc. And the strategic outcome of these operations has remained mixed at best, but at the tactical and operational level, the UAE military appears to be unusually competent for a small Gulf state. Next comes a comparison with Saudi Arabia, and this is where things get interesting and I think perhaps controversial. This is sort of the inevitable comparison that people make, I think in part because UAE and Saudi were the two main contributors to the war in Yemen, and sort of like these are the kind of the two military giants who were most active in that war. The quality of the different forces that contributed to this coalition really varied greatly. But in general, it seems to be true that the Saudis provided mostly mass. We're talking about hundreds of aircraft, significant artillery and ground forces, and the formal political leadership of the coalition. The Emiratis provided a relatively smaller, but more cohesive and arguably more effective expeditionary land component in the south, specialized air and soft capabilities. So the analysis that you can read from the American Enterprise Institute and the Washington Institute and regional think tanks are blunt. They basically say that Saudi Arabia struggled to translate air superiority in high-end hardware into ground success. Its northern campaign failed to eject the Houthis from Sana'a. They did not stop Houthi missile and drone attacks on Saudi territory, and they were able to get only limited and fragile gains on the ground or on the border. The UAE, by contrast, achieved relatively concrete operational gains in southern Yemen, like retaking Aden and several key ports and disrupting Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula and its state-building projects. Even if ultimately this contributed to the fragmentation of Yemen and has yet to yield anything resembling like a stable, unified state. Pollack sort of sums this up into the following metaphor. He says that the UAE has built a small but very sharp spear point, whereas Saudi Arabia has built a very long but relatively blunt spear. The UAE can plan and execute limited joint operations. Saudi Arabia is still hampered by institutional weaknesses in leadership and training deficits that are allegedly characteristic of most Arab militaries. So this takes us to kind of a side question, but I think is relevant here, and it's something that's going to come up in subsequent videos that I do about these Gulf states, which is Pollack's critique of Arab militaries. And this is where, I know African militaries very well. I know less about Arab militaries. So I'm relying here, I'm sort of citing Pollack as an authority, but if you disagree with him, I mean, people disagree with him. So I'm not sort of swearing by Pollack. I'm just saying he's a respected guy who makes some interesting points. View of Pollack and many other analysts, Arab armies, Arab militaries tend to punch below their weight. They can be very large, have lots and lots of stuff. This is particularly true during the Cold War when the Soviets and the Americans were, handing them MiGs and all sorts of stuff, and they was going crazy. But qualitatively speaking, the whole was always far less than the sum of the parts. So the question was always why. And then Pollack and others say that the UAE is an exception, which then leads them to ask, well, why? So Pollack says that there are three types of problems that are endemic with Arab militaries. One, underdevelopment and technical deficits. The argument is basically that because industrialization came late to the Arab world and is still relatively shallow, militaries are short of people who are comfortable with sophisticated machinery, and thus the result is chronic maintenance failure and the underutilization of complex systems. The second part is regime security and politicization. This part I definitely think is probably totally true because it corresponds with what I see in African militaries, which is that many regimes coup-proof their militaries, and they do this by stacking commands with loyalists and fragmenting the forces and prioritizing internal security over warfighting. So the key positions and the promotions go to people who are loyal. The assignments are made based for political reasons, not because of merit or because anybody is any good or talented or anything like that. This is a real problem because this puts politics over warfighting competence, and it produces a brittle, politicized force that is bad at combined arms and all but incapable of the initiative. This leads us to the third general point that Pollack makes, and this is probably the most controversial part of his argument here. He claims that the dominant Arab culture tends to emphasize centralization and deference to authority, passivity and conformity, and shame avoidance, which leads to the manipulation of information. There's also a disdain for technical work and atomized knowledge and rote learning. And these things generally are not good for modern industrial age warfare. So you get weak junior leaders, you've got weak NCO corps, you've got bad reporting and learning. Commanders don't get accurate information. They don't provide accurate information to their superiors. After action reports are sanitized. Mistakes aren't analyzed honestly. So, even if things are completely falling apart, it's a total fiasco, they're going to tell their leadership everything's going great. And then the leadership tells the leadership that everything's going great. And often, the result is that you could have the national leadership as under the illusion that things are going great. I've read, for example, that during the 1948 war, that this is certainly true of all the Arab armies, but like for the Egyptians were getting their asses kicked in many instances by the Israelis, but and often because the Egyptian army was not ready, wasn't prepared, it was inept. But the reality was kept away from the Egyptian leadership, which thought that everything was going great and was telling the public that everything was going great. And then what happens is you've got this huge split between the reality on the ground and sort of the general public perception, which is fueled by the messaging coming out of the leadership, which is determined to view things as if everything was going great. And then at some point, there has to be this moment when they have to realize, like, oh crap, it's not going that well. And then this comes to a shock to the system, shock to the public. It creates all sorts of discordance and cognitive dissonance. It's very, very problematic. So Pollock stresses that these things are patterns. He says they're not absolutes, and it's not about any kind of essential Arabness. But, so he's trying to be careful here because he realizes that he's on thin ice. He says that this is about socialization and educational practices, all of which can be changed. Then comes the argument that the UAE, in fact, has, at least to some extent, overcome these problems. The UAE, in Pollock's telling, is the first Arab state to systematically apply workarounds to these sorts of problems, to address these structural and cultural problems. So others might have conceived of them, but the UAE has actually put them in place, and the UAE has gone further than any of the other Arab militaries in trying to enact these things. So what are examples of this? So first of all, the UAE has opted for a small elite force instead of a mass army. The UAE concentrates its best people, training, foreign mentorship in a few elite formations, the Presidential Guard, the Joint Aviation Command, and top air units. And in them, it tries to foster a Western-style subculture that values meritocracy and values sort of all the things you want to value in a military rather than the politics and the patronage and who belongs to which clan, et cetera, et cetera. This is really a big deal. I mean, like in in African armies, it's always very obvious when you look at like the ethnic breakdown of an African military, when you look at who are the commanders or who's in which units, because some units are more favored than others for purely political reasons. So some units in African armies are lavish with all the newest stuff and given great training opportunities for purely political reasons, which often overlap with ethnic considerations or tribal considerations or family considerations, whereas other units are totally neglected and impoverished and often resentful, which does also tend to lead to, well, besides inefficiency, but also leads to coups. Another important Emirati approach is overmatching with technology, with logistics, and also with allies. Their operations are designed so that the Emirati forces enjoy overwhelming advantages in technology, firepower, ISR, and benefiting from American and other support. That makes up for, this helps for the Emiratis try to acculturate their military so that by its interactions with the Americans and French and others, Emirati leadership wants the military to absorb some of this sort of the command culture and some of the military culture of these other units. So, for example, Western militaries tend to emphasize initiative, for example. So they want that to rub off on the Emirati units the Emirati soldiers that are in the Emirati units. Now, so as part of that, they make heavy use of Western officers and NCOs in key positions. Foreigners, Australians, Americans, and others serve as planners and trainers and do professional military education, particularly in the Presidential Guard and in aviation. So they import Western doctrine and Western training methods, and they quietly identify the most capable Emiratis. In other words, like they're encouraging the Westernization of military units, and they identify those that are most agreeable, amenable, or most embracing of the aspects of Western culture that they want the military to address. I think a lot, whenever I talk about this or read about this, I'm always reminded of the classic example of what happened to Egyptian and Syrian armies when they dealt with the Israelis in the 1960s and 70s, where because of their own cultural issues and baggage, but then also because of the Soviet influence, they were highly, highly centralized and had a culture in which nobody dared take the initiative. You would just wait for orders from the top. You're not allowed to take the initiative, and maybe you're not even trained to do so. So the classic example is in 73, the 1973 war, when the Syrians broke through the Israeli defenses in the Golan Heights. They basically got to the edge of the Golan Heights, could easily have swept down into northern Israel, but they didn't have orders for what to do next. So they actually stopped and waited for the Central Command to tell them what to do. In the meantime, this gave the Israelis time to rally and to marshal a counterattack. Something similar happened in Sinai, where in 73, the Egyptian forces punched through the Israeli defenses far faster than anybody had expected, suddenly found themselves in the middle of the Sinai. And again, they're like, oh, crap, now what do we do? And this enabled the Israelis, who were super good at taking the initiative and super good at being agile and resilient, were able to organize themselves a proper counterattack, and then the rest is history. Another thing that the Emiratis do is they have selective meritocracy inside a patronage system. So there's a balance that they try to strive for. You have a wider officer corps that does still have promotions based on tribe and family, etc. But the Emirati leadership and his lieutenants are trying to carve out a cutting edge where selection and promotion are genuinely performance-based. So they're trying to push it towards a meritocracy at least as much as possible. The best Emiratis, as I said before, are steered into the elite units and protected from the worst of the patronage system. They also, according to Pollock and others, the Emiratis also are working on building a distinct military subculture within those elite formations, in particular, where the leadership tries to cultivate a very different set of norms. Again, it's all about initiative. It's about being honest, like truth to power, and having honest after action reports, a willingness to admit mistakes, a willingness to correct mistakes, and there's a actual attempt to create a military subculture that is just much more attuned to the needs of Western style combined arms and joint maneuver warfare. That's what they say. Well, Pollock doesn't argue that the UAE military is just like the greatest military ever. He's relatively realistic. He's basically saying it's relatively better than most Arab militaries. And he does say it does show some signs of classic Arab military pathologies outside of its at least elite core. For example, rote training, passive junior leadership, poor junior leadership, poor maintenance, etc. And even the best units, in the best units, you're going to find that colonels and brigadiers are doing directly things that in a Western military would be delegated to lower echelon commanders and even NCOs. So it's not fully a westernized force or a Western force, but it's more Western-like. It's westernized and westernizing. It's a work in progress that the Emirati leadership is trying to cultivate. Okay, so in closing, if we zoom out, what we have is the UAE is a very small but very rich state that has decided to buy and build a niche high-end military rather than a mass force. And it's geared in order to be able to do basically expeditionary operations. And this is significant because this requires a higher level of sophistication, I believe, than just sort of like a territorial defense kind of military. You just need smarter people. You need a higher level of planning abilities, greater skill sets. It has a proven ability, or rather it has an impressive tactical and operational record in limited wars, and it also is a test case for the optimistic view of Arab military effectiveness in a context in which one has the right leadership and the right institutional forms. You can get a lot out of these militaries if it's led by the right people trying to do the right thing. So what about the Iran war? So I deduce from all of the above that the prospect of the UAE throwing its full weight into the war against Iran as a serious matter. The UAE, despite its small size, has considerable weight to throw around. In particular, if the UAE Air Force were to start conducting offensive combat operations against the Iranians, they absolutely have the capabilities to make a significant contribution. Also, to the extent that there might be a role for soft and mechanized armored units on the ground in Iran, not saying that's a good idea, but to the extent that there might be need for that, the UAE absolutely could, not saying would, but they could provide an element, a useful element. They could make a significant contribution to any kind of land operations. The UAE also could be effective on the coastline, and in dealing with islands. Now, one thing I don't know is a question that applies really to all militaries these days, which is how well can the Emiratis handle the drone threat that is now omnipresent in places like Ukraine? How can they manage this? So it's one thing to defend oil fields from drone attacks, but it's another thing to defend infantry on the ground or mechanized units or people who are trying to establish a beachhead somewhere. That's really, really hard to do. Can they do that? I don't know. But this is also a question that the United States Marine Corps had better be asking themselves too, because I don't know how good they are at this sort of thing either. Lastly, I fully expect the UAE to spend ungodly sums of money on weapons moving forward. This is a great time to be in the arms industry. Yay. Thank you very much. I hope you like this video. If you look in the description, you'll also find links to my Substack, also called Pax Americana, my own website, michaelshurkin.com, plus my Twitter account, my Blue Sky, and my LinkedIn. And that's it. Please stay tuned. There's a lot more in the pipeline. Next video up will be Saudi Arabia, although there's always a possibility that events are going to turn me away, and I'm going to end up having to talk about something else, the way things are going, but we shall see. But that's my intention, at least. Thank you very much. Bye bye.